Hello, everybody. My name is Nathan Byrd, founder of Acquisition Conference, coming to Salt Lake City on March 21st. And I'm also the host here of the Acquisition IQ podcast. And we are joined today with Stan Freck. He worked for Microsoft for over 23 years. He's led thousands of individuals as a form of team and growing the Microsoft organization as well as others. And he has his own business with It's a consulting company for leadership within organizations. We're excited to be able to have you on the podcast today and just learn a little bit more about what it is you're doing.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me, Nathan. Really appreciate it. It's great to be here today.
Absolutely. So share with us a little bit more of your background. What do you really enjoy? And then why are you on the leadership path to help other people?
Sure. So my background's in sort of a strange path, right? It wasn't path that I planned, if you will. I got a degree in aerospace engineering. I don't think it's been used the way it was intended since the day it was minted, but it taught me how to think about things systematically, how to think about interconnected things in terms of mechanical systems, but it applies in the real world for people interactions as well. And so I spent my career, a little bit of time before Microsoft in the consulting world, working with public sector excuse me.
Yeah, it's okay.
Sorry, I spent the early part of my career working as a consultant with mostly public sector clients, some private clients as well, but then moved over to Microsoft in '95. And I've did everything there, basically except back office operations, finance, HR, and so forth. So I was in product, I was in sales, I was in marketing. I worked with folks around the world, every continent except Antarctica, and did a lot of change management work actually at the company, a lot of trying to figure out what we should do internally, how we should adjust to market realities, how do we absorb new organizations and figure out how to move forward as an entity with these new components and have healthier situations for our people as well.
One thing we talked about prior to this conversation was the engineering of both, the human mind as well as the engineering of, physical structures and things that you have to do when you're going to school for those type of things. Let's talk about the engineering of culture within a company, and then also why companies are in disarray at times, but then how do you engineer them back on track to focus in on what cohesion is and how they can perform at a high level?
Yeah, and most of my work is with leaders, with folks, and you can be a leader at anywhere in an organization, by the way, right? I'm not talking about a specific title or per se. And a lot of my work actually at Microsoft was thinking about and working on how do you lead without being given the keys, the responsibility, the authority, but how do you actually lead the organization even if you don't have those things? And through that work and through those thoughts led me to some pretty clear understanding that the best leaders are people who are clear, they have a clear vision, a clear mission, but those things are integrated with the views of the folks that they're working with. They're not sitting in a white tower and ivory tower and creating these things and then bringing them out to the masses. And so worked a lot over the last decade or so and do now in my practice, both working as a coach to senior leaders as well as consulting and advising to companies on how do these leaders show up authentically, how do they bring the rest of their team in to have a shared view and a shared vision of what's possible. And when there are breaks and when there are disconnects within those organizations, are they actually listening? Are they paying attention to the signals that are coming in? And are they humble enough to accept that they aren't going to have all the answers and to actually reach out to the rest of the organization to bring them together to figure out how to move forward? And part of that is this true. It's just a truth that in my coaching, for example, if I tell somebody what to do, if I'm coaching you and I say, well, Nathan, here, I've heard what you've said. Here's what I think you need to do. You might actually go try that. But the reality is, if I can coach you to think about what your options are and decide what the best path forward is in your estimation, which may or may not be exactly what I think, you're going to be highly committed to that. That's your idea. That's your mission. And you're going to actually be much more vested in the success of that. So the likelihood of it coming out and turning out successful is much higher than if I tell you what to do. And besides, I'm no longer your excuse. You don't get to say, well, Stan told me that, and it was just a dumb idea. So it takes that off the table.
That's interesting engineering. I can sense the wheels turning in your brain already about how you're engineering the performance within a company, but also within the individuals. Let's talk a little bit about how within a company they have mission, values, and culture. And have you ever seen or been a part of a company that has lost the mission, values, and culture?
I think I've certainly seen companies where they've lost their way. And often that's because if you step back to those three stages, mission, values, and culture, I think a lot of companies create values by putting 5 things on a piece of paper. And my belief, and I think the best practice in the industry, is that your values are the things that are core to you. They don't change over time. And so when you get together with a team of people to try and figure out what your core values are, you've got to have an exploration. You've got to have a conversation. You've got to figure out what they are, not what you aspire for them to be, right? And so if you put down these 5 things on paper and they aren't truly your core values, you in a crisis, in a situation of stress, you will revert to whatever your core values really are. And so if you don't do that work to come together as an organization up front and think about what those are and how you're going to operate around those, when the excuse the expression, shit hits the fan, the truth will come out at that point. And so
we're seeing that actually within leaders. One leader will say one thing, and then their actions aren't matching what they just said because they're inauthentic.
Exactly right.
So within your practice, how many times have you come across that? Has that been many times?
Sadly, you see it all the time, because part of it is an authentic leader in the moment, in the course of the day-to-day, isn't being performative. They're not trying to put on an act. They're not trying to present in a certain way. And you see a lot of folks, whether it's because of their own lack of confidence or they haven't sort of resolved for themselves, what their sort of position in the world is, and having the belief that what I'm doing is right and I'll work from that core, they'll, as you say one thing in public and say something else in private. They'll essentially, I have somebody that I'm working with right now who, and I'm not going to name names, but has been feeling like another person that works for them is a problem, right? And is a challenge, and isn't going to be up to snuff, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, when that person was moving on, in front of the entire organization, started singing their praises. Everybody in the room knew that this leader had been essentially trying to figure out how to move this person on, not happy with their performance. So it was very clear to everybody else in the room that, this person behaves like this and then says other things in front of everyone. And so they don't believe him anymore, right? He's lost his ability to have any sort of trust or any sort of sense of veracity with his entire team because he's not being authentic to what he believes. They would have respected him by saying nothing, frankly. There was somebody else who stepped up and said nice things about this individual when they were leaving. He didn't need to step into that breach, but he did because he felt he needed to perform.
This is insightful. So in the midst of a one company wanting to acquire another company, based on the title of this podcast and some of the things that we're wanting to drive out here, is that we want performance amongst an organization, and we want teams to be able to work together at a high level. What would you share to our audience on how to achieve that optimal performance post a merger between two companies creating a new vision?
Right. And I think I mentioned this earlier when we were chatting. There's a couple different flavors out there, right? You might do an acquisition. Microsoft might acquire, for example, a company to acquire the talent. It's an acqui-hire, basically. They're not concerned about the IP. In fact, they're probably going to deprecate it and move it out. They might just want the IP, right? They might not be looking to hang on to those individuals, or they might actually be wanting to bring in this entire entity and either integrate it or allow it to run somewhat independently, right? Loosely coupled, if you will. And depending on what flavor we're talking about, the sort of 5 things I think you need to think hard about it in an acquisition, the importance of those shifts a little bit. One of them, which maybe because it was Microsoft, right, and big tech, isn't as big a deal for smaller businesses generally in this path, but it's sort of regulatory and compliance questions, right? So that's sort of table stakes for some of these companies to do this acquisition. The second thing is, have you done your financial and due diligence on the buy side? And have you on the sell side prepared yourself for that conversation and for that digging into your finances and into your business? The third thing is back to what we were talking about a little bit now, which is there a culture and an organization fit? And that assumes, of course, that you're going to want to absorb those teams and those organizations. Second one is there a market fit? Do you have, does the IP suit your strategy? And the final one is this strategic alignment between these things. And you can imagine if all I'm doing is acquiring the people, it matters much more to me to have the organizational and cultural fit than it does to have a market fit between whatever IP they might have created, and vice versa if I'm just acquiring that. If I'm trying to bring the whole entity in, it's really an interesting dance, right? Because you've got an owner who built this with their sweat, tears, and blood, usually, if it's a first-time owner that's selling this company to the acquirer. And they look at it in a very different way than the acquirer does in terms of the IP and the value of that. The acquirer bought it for a price. It is an asset that they purchased. The owner has a very different sort of feeling about that thing. And so getting into an organization that might act towards the thing you built, your baby, differently than you would necessarily act towards that can be a real challenge for a lot of folks. And you see, especially when you're moving into a very strong culture, like we saw Microsoft has a fairly strong culture, that fit has to be pretty strong for people to go, yeah, I enjoy this, I like this, this is how I would operate, for them to stick around. Some of the worst acquisitions in Microsoft's history, I'll take Aquantive as an example, $6 billion plus acquisition. Is an online advertising platform. Microsoft was making a move into digital advertising, and lo and behold, not only wasn't there a strategic fit, that the platform didn't support the strategy Microsoft wanted to pursue, which is almost inexcusable, but all of the senior leaders of Aquantive very quickly turned around and left the company because it wasn't a fit. Good people on both sides of the conversation, right? I know folks certainly on the Microsoft side of that. But it just wasn't a fit. It just wasn't. They didn't operate in the same way, and it was a debacle. Microsoft wrote off the entire $6 billion in a very short order. So you contrast that with something like Microsoft's acquisition of LinkedIn, which has been very successful. There are strategic synergies. The businesses sort of resonate with each other. There are sales opportunities, marketing opportunities. The market's aligned. They didn't interfere, and Microsoft also made a decision to allow LinkedIn to be fairly autonomous because the leadership, they respected the leadership. The leadership had a vision for what they were trying to do with LinkedIn, and that's worked out fairly well.
Autonomy within an organization, and we know this to be true, is extremely important, but also you've got your North Star that the company holds out, right, which is your mission and your values. Share with me a little bit more about how important that plays into the teams that are merging, the autonomy.
Yeah, autonomy is an interesting one, right? Because it's a double-edged sword to some degree, right? If you're bringing in something that you truly want to integrate, that's part of the core value is a deep integration between both the IP, the assets, and the people, then you can't have this sort of two different camps and they special treatment of this group, and they keep a different set of structures and systems and processes and everything else. And so that's more mechanically challenging to some degree, right? And there's also overlaps that you're going to have to deduplicate, right? And that's where it gets really a little messy, right? Because a good leader, a good founder will have both a commitment to their company, but a commitment to their people too. They built this team. They built this organization of people, this team, this collection of individuals, which is all a company is really at the end of the day. And so coming into a place where, oh, wait, there are admins, there are people doing finance, there are people doing whatever the underlying support functions are, and in fact, even at the core functions, right? There are engineers, there are people doing support work. They've got systems in place to do customer service. Figuring that out and doing it up front, doing it as part of due diligence, as part of the conversation to the degree that you're able, is really crucial. Because what you don't want to do is try and figure it out when you're in the messiness of, we've already had this transaction, so now we're sort of stuck. And so a lot of that is about integration planning up front.
I like that, integration planning. One company will purchase another company, and a lot of times they're looking at the bottom line. They're looking at the numbers in the production or EBITDA, for example, and they're not looking at, or at least implementing implementing practice or an integration practice. Okay. That's what I'm saying. And I think that I'm just saying that I think that's so important. As companies, we've got to look at scheduling out a very organized way of planning to integrate, and then almost prep for a way that it's not going to work, but also a way that it can work.
Yeah, it is interesting. I've seen enough examples of people who thought through the financials.
Yes.
Right, and we know how we're going to integrate the P&L, but we haven't thought through the mechanics of the organization and how it's going to operate, how it's going to work, what is and is, where is it going to break, where is it going to overlap, so that you've got two people sitting in the same seat, which is never a good thing for either of them going forward. Right? So
I don't know the exact percentages of failures within companies that acquire other companies based on their integration failures, but I know it's got to be 70 to 80%.
I'm sure it's pretty high. I'm sure it is. Yeah,
and it's probably because of this lack.
Well, it's funny. It's back to essentially the thing I focus on most, which is teams, organizations, and leadership in those spaces. Because even though my background's technical, even though I cut code once upon a time, I realized that the harder and for me the more interesting problems all revolved around the people. And I actually had somebody once, two stories. Once somebody asked me what it was like to lead, manage people. And first of all, I think those are two very different things.
Yes.
And I said, well, this people management thing would be easy if it wasn't for the people. Because at the end of the day, it's really all about what their concerns are, their issues, those. And if you don't have time or energy to sort of integrate that into how you're approaching the business, you will eventually be isolated from your own organization. And the reason leaders often don't know what's going on in their organization is because they have not made the time and the energy to take on board that that's a big part of what they need to do, which is to engage with their people and understand what's going to motivate them, what's going to set them up for success. Because at the end of the day, the company doesn't grow based on the backs of one person.
That's so good. Share with us more about your organization and maybe some strategies and tips for those out there that are running their organizations, and how, one, they could utilize some insight from you, but also maybe utilize you.
So, the primary focus of what I'm doing today is definitely leans towards, but not solely, towards leadership coaching, non-directive coaching primarily. So we can talk about that in depth some other day, probably what that means, what that actually unlocks for people. But the idea being that at the end of the day, you can have the best team around you, but if you have a dysfunctional leader, the team will move towards some sense of dysfunction. They may rally against you, but one way or the other, you're going to not have a healthy place. And so I work on that quite a bit with leaders. I work on that with leaders at all levels within organizations, because as I think I said earlier, I think you can lead from anywhere. And leadership is an act, not a title. It's something you do. And so there are techniques and ways in which you can become and be a leader, and it's not bestowed upon you, right? It's not an award that you get or a promotion. Those are management conversations, and you can lead as an individual contributor. You can lead as the front desk person at organizations. I've seen as huge leaders at times, right? They are the face and the front of that organization, and they set a tone. And so tips and tricks, at the end of the day, it really comes back to being human with humans, right? And saying, okay, wait, this is a group of people that have come together. How do we align against a common interest? How do we line ourselves up to do that? What are the differences across that organization? And what do I need to accommodate? And at what point do I need to say, okay, everybody's, make sure everybody gets a hearing, make sure everybody feels heard and feels seen, because that's what most people want. They don't necessarily want to be the decision maker at all times. They don't need to be right even all the time, but if they're not being listened to, not being heard, they will just shut down and go into a mode that's, I'm just going to do my work. I'm going to walk out the door at 4 o'clock and try and get away from that and go do something I enjoy, because I need the paycheck or whatever it is. And so how do you align those folks? How do you align interests? And how do you rally behind a shared and a common mission? And there's ways to do that and facilitated ways to do that I can help with. But a lot of it comes back to being open to the fact that everybody in that organization is not going to be the same. It's not a set of parts that you can just sort of put into a box. And so being sensitive to that and understanding how to navigate that, how to set them up for success.
You've said multiple times during this interview, leadership versus management. Mm-hmm. Can you explain that?
What's the best way to explain that?
Definitions.
Yeah.
Potentially.
Management, my simple explanation, and I just have a reptilian brain, so I have to go simple. If I go complicated, I can't remember it. My simple sort of definition is management is the discipline of structuring, and monitoring and correcting systems, processes, where leadership is about setting a vision, setting up a North Star, I think you referred to it as, which I use as well, and understanding how the organization is oriented and organized in order to get there, and making course corrections, again, but not at the same sort of micro level that you're talking about on a management level, but making sure people know where the guardrails are, that, hey, I want to empower you. I want you to be able to make independent decisions, because as an organization, you'll accelerate and go much faster if you can fly in formation, is what I call it, as opposed to having to command and control, and you have to approve everything up the chain through all avenues. And don't get me wrong, Microsoft's a big company, right? So there's a lot of big company stuff that comes along with that sort of place, but also a healthy disrespect for authority. And by that, all I mean is not rebellious, but just because somebody is in a position, or just because there is something that's written that says this is how this is, doesn't mean it's how it should be forever, right? So question it. If it's not serving us, then you disrupt it and figure out what the next thing should be. And of course, all within legal boundaries and all the other things that you need to do. And so leadership, from my perspective, is really about being attuned to the team and to the people in your organization, and are they set up for success to get you to where you're trying to go, where management is running the trains to some degree.
That's so good. I loved your perspective on having a shaking things up a little bit, basically, within the confines of structure that's already been created, because I think that's really where innovation takes place, and at some point. But well, hey man, I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation today. I hope you guys have too. And is there any way that we can support you, or how do we get a hold of you? You have a LinkedIn?
Yeah, the easiest thing to get a hold of me, LinkedIn's fine. Okay. You can find Stan Freck on LinkedIn, LinkedIn/in/Stan Freck, gets you there. You can go to my site, stanfreckcoaching.com. You can see sort of my philosophy there. You can see my ugly mug there as well. And there's a form there to say, hey, if you're interested in working with me, reach out. There's a quote from my mother on that site, which says, if you don't ask, the answer is no. So ask.
I love that. Well, guys, if you have not yet got your ticket to come to the acquisition conference, where Stan will also be there helping us go through a small little facilitation to increase the overall performance of your team within your culture, and have a little bit more insight as to how leadership can play a major role in you personally as well as professionally. So make sure grab your ticket at aquacon.live, and we look forward to seeing you in the room.